Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for your presence in this roundtable, essential for the future of our country, the ambition of France in the domain of defense. Let's move on rapidly. We are running out of time. So first and foremost, I would like to give the floor to Christian Saint-Etienne, who will set the stage of the situation in terms of defense, and of course with the war in Ukraine, in Iran, with global tensions. The defense issues are back to the forefront. Christian will define the context today. Why is it important? Why is this ambition for France? Good morning. What ambition for French defense? We all know the context with war in Europe, war in the Med region, war in the Gulf, and the risk in the Pacific. So within this context, we have to reshuffle the French capabilities. We do have a great war army, but a study from the French Parliament 2 years ago showed that France at the time had 8 days of only 8 days of ammunition with the new military law and the vote which took place 48 hours ago in the Parliament. We are raising the defense budget, which will double, which will have doubled in a couple of years. But we have to restore all the military capabilities, including ammunition piles and stocks. We've seen that the availability of missiles and drones is clearly the key point. Now, are we able to have the necessary effort to resist any risk or any... And we need to do this massive effort of defense capacity consolidation in a context where budgetary equilibria or balance are fairly difficult to achieve. We have a public expenditure which is, with 57 points of PIBs of public defense, 34 points of GDP for social protection, social welfare, 1/4 of public expenditure are pensions. Now, can we recombine this welfare model and a large part of the population is used to thinking that there was no financial constraint. So can we reconcile this social protection model with an increase of military budgets, not to mention schools, hospitals, and green transition? So in view of this stack of challenges, now in terms of budget and technology industry, are we capable of achieving this transition? It is. Thank you. To discuss this, a panel composed of Éric Béranger, who is the CEO of MBDA, which is the largest manufacturer of missiles in Europe, and who is number 3 in the world. Next to him, Estelle Braic-Chanoff, Director General of Veolia, one of the world leader in environment and energy. Then Stéphane Boujna, who is the Director General of Euronext, first stock exchange hub in Europe. Nicolas Dufour, Director General of BPI France. And finally, Gabriel Attal, former Prime Minister, who is Secretary General of Renaissance, who is running for the next presidential election. Now, each of the speakers will give his vision or her vision, and then there will be a discussion. Éric Béranger, CEO of MBDA. Good morning. first time that NVIDIA comes to the Economic Forum. Let me introduce NVIDIA. NVIDIA is a company which serves the French sovereignty and European sovereignty, with the world's third producer of missiles, first in Europe, about 20,000 employees, 8,500 in France. And beyond the fact that we are a French company, we are a European player because we are French, British, German, Italian, Spanish, and which bears witness of the fact that cooperation may work. And in our domain, this cooperation is essential. This is what enables us to cover the entire spectrum of what we cover: complex ammunitions, from that is drones, anti-air, solar protection, and nuclear dissuasion or deterrence, nuclear deterrence, because today we are concerned, pay a lot of attention to what goes on in the world, because our systems are used in Ukraine, in the Red Sea, in the Middle East, almost on a daily basis, with a high demand from soil-air defense, in-depth strikes, which will be the two main topics of the NATO summits on July 7th, 8th. So today, our main topic as NVIDIA is the acceleration and increase of volume, and we want to make sure that the portfolio of systems will evolve to respond to the needs of the states. Thank you. Thank you. Hello. Maybe I might surprise some of you. Veolia is a defense company as well. This gentleman, of course, we need drones and we need missiles, but Veolia builds the strategic autonomy. How do we do that? Because the first defense, for me, is that of resources, ensure water supply, ensure energy supply, ensure strategic raw material supply, rare earths, and so on and so forth. This includes the defense industries, but also the population and the daily life. So our daily lives. So we see that every day. We've seen it in Ukraine. It was not just military organizations which were bombed, in a power plant, for example, a dam. Between India and Pakistan, the Indus issue is a geostrategic challenge. When there is, when pressure rises, the Indus tap is shut. Middle East, where desalination plants are actually targeted by bombings. So we realize also that Europe has a need for strategic autonomy, access to resources, ensure safe access to resources. Just to give you a figure, 98% of strategic ores are imported into Europe. And I could talk about fossil energies as well. So behind each major conflict, there is also a conflict of access to resources and utilities, and it is essential to be safe. I will now give the floor to Stéphane Boujna, who is the manager of Euronext. Hello. Euronext is a European group, a financial group based on a very simple principle. Either we succeed together or we fail separately. So it comprises, capital market in Norway, in Ireland, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in France, in Italy, Portugal, Greece, and basically twice as large as all markets in London, and 2-3 times larger than London. It is more directly to the topic of the day. It was reminded us that the main constraints we face is that of public expenditures to our public budget. Together in this room here, we're going to spend 77 billion euros to pay the charge of the debt. Next year it will be 85 million. We pay more money paying the debt than financing the school systems. Germans, in the meantime, if we extrapolate, you have to know that next year the following year we'll pay more for our debt holders than what we spend for us. So this is the meta constraint. So the question is, how can we do more with less? Because at the time when we have to do everything indicated, we will, in the next 5 years, there will be a shrinking restructuration of all our public finance capabilities. And Gabriel Attal was very clear in this in Le Parisien. So that's the horizon. How can we do more with less? More, because as Thucydides said, to rest or to remain free, you have to choose. You don't choose your neighbors, but there's neighbors of our neighbors. And therefore, how can we do more with less? And therefore, we have to find resources where they are available. The first one is free time. French society has a huge deposit of energy, which is not activated, it's free time. And this free time is already used in civic lives and in associations or community groups. And I think it is a transformation of the spirit, transform the Frenchmen, or French people, not in consumers or observers of armed forces, but in producers of defense. That is reform of the operational reserve force and the commitment of companies. So what I would like us to do is for us to go like very much in the Nordic countries, total defense, but we won't have a choice because of the budgetary constraints. We'll have to do that, We will have to do homeopathic requisition for companies or free conscription for citizens. Otherwise, there will be no sustainable defense effort. Nicolas Dufour, manager of the BP France, do we have the means? I will repeat things that have been said, but my own way. For the last 20 years now, if we look at the GDP, of what they did, we spent 14 points of GDP more than the Germans. So they do more, So we get in the situation where we have we held our industrial basis and in fact and over global projection, but at the cost of another projection, which is quite through the date into the future, which is kind of choking us today. So, well, we need to sanctuarize, the military law, 6 billion more per year, and therefore it is impossible to tell the French people that this will have an impact and there will be more demand for, to have an impact or, and especially social expenditure, welfare expenditure. We have to tell them. This is what Stéphane said. I think we are aware of this problem, which is difficult to express because, we'll have to do it anyway. So bearing in mind that the snowball of the debt is increasing, the debt burden will be 12 billion and the following year and so on and so forth. So all the figures are in the report of the auditor, national auditors. So. Well, we finance the defense, the enterprises of, small SMEs, they like 6 million turnover, clearly, that we with the little SMEs, in all over France, for some piece, a component or part or whatever. We finance about 1.5 billion per year. Bearing in mind that in the coming years, between now and 2030, budgets that will be assigned to defense will increase by 35 billion. Because all these companies already use, we need to invest a lot. We'll have to invest how much? 15 billion. Out of the 15 billion between now and 2030, BBPI will do about half of it. That's all I can tell you. Gabriel Attal, your turn. You got no microphone, sorry. Thank you. As many of you here, I went to Ukraine 4 times in the last few years. And whoever goes to Ukraine comes back with absolute conviction. What is at stake today when we talk about defense as a war is not just time of evolution, it's a deep change in nature. And just as the invention of powder and ended the castles and allowed states to be reinforced, just as the industrial revolution allowed the industrialization of defense instruments, what is at stake today with drones, AI, quantum computation is a change, deep change in the nature of war. And power is not just to have the largest number of tanks or planes, is that in being able to innovate and accelerate faster than the others, to protect your critical infrastructures, to influence on public opinion, to influence public opinion. And if we are not collectively able to understand that, we will be pushed aside. Just as those who still think about the cavalry at the time of gunpowder were killed, and those who think in terms of Napoleonic wars at the time of Industrial Revolution and the arrival of the First World War were pushed aside. So now we have to, and this is the case in the criminalization of the in the military programmation law. So we need to innovate. All our policies have to based on innovation. I will propose a new white paper for defense in 2027. The last one dates back to 2013. At the time, the most threat was terrorism. Everything has changed. So in our reading of the time and priorities, everything has to change. Likewise, I will propose a review of programs for each program so that we can review our priorities and our organization. And when we talk about innovation, of course, there is a financial stake in the last military programming law. Innovation is 10 billion euros. It's a lot. But when you refer it to more than 400 billion euros, is not that much, And I think the notion of financing, we'll discuss it again. Second should be to accelerate. Today, the time unit is what you understand when you see it's no longer the decade, it's not the it's the month, and we have to so a lot of change for the organization in the States and the Ministry of Armed Forces. And cooperate in Europe, and if we want to it means that there must be industrial and political and defense priorities in Europe. So the history has shown that time of rupture does not necessarily reward the most powerful, but those who understand before the others that the rules of the game have changed. We can see that should we accelerate or should we have a true defense policy, industrial policy, a policy that will to have, but how to finance it? Gabriel Attal this morning said that he wants to reduce the deficit from 5 to 3%. So how do we do that for defense? Where do we find the money? So we have to make it first. Everybody says so. So before that, I will give the floor to Yves Béranger because you are one of the main defense industrialists. While Ukraine hit Russia with missiles, Scalp missiles, French-British missiles, Franco-British missiles. So what should be the priority for France, for missiles, but not only? In your opinion, what is the absolute priority? I'd like to come back to the topic of rules of the law which have changed, because I agree, but I go even further than that. We just coming out of about 30, 40 years of peace. Those defense issues or topics are subjects that people don't know well. So to me, the fundamental change is that the world has changed. We've moved from a world based on rule of law or international rule of law to a world of brutality, violence, shameless violence, hence the need for a true defense policy, hence the need for defense policy and the measures that have to be implemented. Now, second thing is that, France occupies a specific position, very specific position in Europe, because we're the ones to have a full model. But nevertheless, all European countries, even the richest one, even Germany, we talk about, at best are medium-sized powers. And when you deal with US or China, the only way, and I'm certainly convinced about that, the only way for us, French and Europeans, to keep being alive and to work together. And PDA is a proof that it works. So now, to work together, well, we have everything we need. We have everything we need in Europe. We got skills, we got scientific skills, we got industrial skills, we even have the industrial tools. The only topic is to be able to get together and work together. So, and this is what we do at the level of France, to start with. Industrialists like MBDA, it's not the only one. All the prime products are in the same situation. An industrialist like MBDA is in charge of an ecosystem. And we got 2,000 suppliers, excluding the SMEs, which are not that big, not that rich, and we have to take care of them because we nurture them, we depend on them, and they depend on us. So clearly, this is this ecosystem work necessary to make sure that everybody will ramp up or scale up, and it's teamwork between the prime contractor and the suppliers, but teamwork with the state, with investors. It's all this entire ecosystem that has to work together. So what's your priority to ensure this?
Pour assurer la défense.
To guarantee French defence. Today, the priority is to meet our customers' needs, but today, between 2023 and 2025, with our suppliers, we multiplied our global missile production by 2 on anti-air defence. So the Aster was deployed in Ukraine, but it was also used in the Red Sea to protect not only our ships, but the commercial navy, and it is unrolled in the Middle East. And so we delivered 5 times more Asters in 2025 than planned. This year we will make twice more, once again, for an industrial company. And above all, the supply chain, it's enormous. And that is our priority today. That is what we're working on every day. How do we develop all of this? In April, I announced that we were currently doubling our 5-year investment plan, and we're scaled it up to 5 billion euros over 5 years to help our suppliers and to develop our industrial capacities. So you're saying speeding things up, everybody understands, due to the 2 wars for which you're supplying equipment. But we saw recently that France and Germany couldn't come to an agreement to manufacture the famous Scalp, the plane of the future. The program has therefore been abandoned. Gabriel Attal, if you're a president, would you relaunch the plane of the future between France and Germany, or is it over and we cannot work with the Germans? Well, in any case, yes, I would relaunch it. So, as I said, for the SCAF, this is a subject that I've worked on a lot. So I reached Matignon without many thoughts on the subject. I was not in charge of defence beforehand, but as Prime Minister, I was in charge of our country's defence. And my first trip abroad was to Germany. I think that there is a lot that we can do in terms of disruption, but there is a great deal of constance in the Franco-German relationship. And once I was appointed, I went to Berlin to dine with Chancellor Olaf Scholz at the time. And I immediately understood that it wouldn't work for a number of reasons, in fact. If you want a European cooperation project to work, we must have the same objectives, our industrialists must have the same objectives, and we must be able to have a conductor and somebody to orchestrate all of this. And so we didn't want to have the same plane. The Germans wanted a heavy plane. We wanted a furtive plane. We have nuclear dissuasion, which is not their case. We have an aircraft carrier, which is not their case. So we didn't have the same objectives either with regard to our industrialists. The Germans wanted to get their industrials working. We wanted to focus on the armies, and the Spanish wanted to scale up their industrial sector. And so, it couldn't work in those conditions. So I think that we must save what can be saved of the SCAF. And of course, this is the fighting cloud that we must continue, because actually the MBDA drones, is iron. Assault planes are irons, but the cloud, the fighting cloud of the future is what we must develop. It's what helps us to move a defense bubble at the speed of sound. I'll just end on European cooperation. We can do this with other European countries. Now, you've seen that there's a failure of the Scalp, but there was an agreement signed between France and Germany for the KNDS industrialist, which is one of the big military manufacturers. Yes, absolutely. And moreover, there are other corporations that we can have with other European players. We made the Nuremberg with Saab and the Swedish, and the Scalp with the British, and others with the Italy. I think there are a dozen or so cooperation programs that work very well with France, but as it works, people don't talk about it. So yes, European cooperation obviously has a future, even though the SCAF was a failure, and we must continue this. So in 2029, Germany will have a 150 billion euro defense budget, and France will be at 75 billion. So will Germany take the precedence? Well, yes, of course. And this justifies all of the efforts made in recent years that we must continue to make. I would like to recall that the budget of the army in France between 2017 and 2027 would have more than doubled. It's more than a doubling in 2 5-year periods. When we compare it with the 2 previous 5-year periods, objectively on that subject, the comparison is difficult for a certain number of political leaders, because the reality is that there's never been such a big effort. And of course, we have to continue this to reach our common objectives within NATO, to accomplish our military program that was voted, and prepare for the next one. But once again, on the basis of a real deep-rooted review of our priorities. And this is why I will propose a new white paper for defence. So would you like to react? Yes, I entirely agree. But because we are here to speak usefully, well, the same country, Ukraine, created investors, and there was an investment month in Kiev. The French sovereign means are so limited that we're behind quite a few European countries in terms of the number of weapons and budget, because, we just can't keep up. So the elephant that is in the room, once again, is that we're being suffocated. And the fact that we must use our debt to fund weapons, and we're using it to fund retirement. So we have to really tackle the problem. Today we can't see it that much because our foreign policy, thanks to the talent of the President of France, we must say, appears to be a policy of power. But when you look at the real figures of what we can do for the Ukrainians, we're behind the Danish, because the Danish have been through their social reform. So I'm obliged to come back to this. No, we have to tell the French people the truth, and we have to tell them that they will have to make efforts. Where do these efforts come from? Retirements. We have to stop funding retirement. So in order to boost the funding of France's defence, you cannot fund purchasing power by debt. The purchasing power, meaning the income we give to French people every week or every month that allow them to pay their water bills, their electricity bills, that cannot be funded with debt. And that we've been doing that for 40 years. So what we're putting in the French people's shopping basket, we cannot put in weapons to defend Ukraine. I'm going to give the floor to Estelle Brachlianoff, but before that, Stefan Bujna. we can see that in what Nicolas Dufour was saying, which is that we need to wake up to the reality of finances. And to ensure this ambition of the defence, there are questions of budget, but also what we can call a spirit of defence in France. Does this exist? And how do we get there? Do you have any ideas on this? Well, it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel. The countries that have tricky neighbours and that need to dissuade their neighbours from attempting the slightest hostile initiative all get organised in the same way. And so it is our friends from Northern Europe. Of course, there are people such as the Norwegians, which are blessed by nature and contribute to more than 20% of Ukrainians' expenditure, because the Norwegians are purchasing most of the Ukrainian weapon purchases. But beyond this, there are countries that have organised what they call total defence. And that's the case in Denmark, in Sweden, in Finland, of course, and very broadly in Norway. What does this consist in? Well, that everybody knows what they have to do if one day the tension turns into a crisis. So, of course, it's easier in countries that have re-established national service for boys and girls, and so we continue to monitor the availability of everybody, but we need to go through something of this kind for citizens and for companies. For citizens, because, for example, in Renex, we decided within the scope of a big initiative called the New Energy Security and Geostrategy Initiative, we pay 3 weeks per year for people who are in the operational reserve for the first year, and then 2 weeks. And that's a lot, because that's plus 5 weeks of paid leave. That means over 12 months, you're paying the employees 10 months to work for Onyx, 5 weeks to go on holiday, and 3 weeks to serve their country. So it's very useful. I'll give you a very concrete example. A few weeks ago, the National Navy called us. They quickly needed a lot of data capacity to process all of the data scientists to deal with all of the data that they had to manage, and it was very useful. So the French Navy is a very flexible, very effective and agile service. But we all need to participate in this way, and companies too. In Northern Europe, each company, including the Ronex platforms, know exactly what they have to do if things are going wrong with their underground car parks, their different teams, and their generators. So just a word, you're saying that we must transform the French that are today defence consumers into producing consumers. Yes, there are 34,000 towns and as many elected representatives that do tremendous work. There's an associative life that, fill in the gaps where public service is failing, and we must, find the pathway back to what was the biggest part of our history, the contribution of each inhabitant and citizen to defence, which beforehand was national, that has ceased with being national, and that must become national once again, or total. But one word, this previous subject was very important, that of European cooperation. In the world of Trump, Xi Jinping and Putin, there are three people who decided to weaken Europe. There is no other solution than an extremely advanced European cooperation. And this is what is explaining the tension between the regimes. We're fighting between people who are saying we need speed and size and scale, and others are saying, oh, yes, but if you engage in cooperation, you lose speed. That slows everything down, and that is Dassau's thesis. And there are those that say, no, we need to work together to scale things up. But actually, the solution is we need to do both. You have an extraordinary example with Sweden. A few weeks ago, Sweden tried to buy 4 regattes from us. Then we're not going to manufacture the regattes. And last year, we bought 3 or 4 Global Eyes, the equivalent of the Airwaxes, because we don't know how to make them, and they make excellent ones. So that was not cooperation. Everybody bought from the other what they knew how to make the fastest. But in other cases, there's a problem of scaling up. And this is, the BDA projects, the different projects mentioned by Gabriel Attal, which are the solution. But for this, the cautious of industrialists we must manage to go beyond this. But in many sectors, the problem is that the operators are very cautious, and it's not the common will of the states. And that's why we need a very strong political will to go beyond this caution of the industrialists. So we, Esther, you're a bit of an outsider because you wonder what Veolia has to do with defense. You know, you worked on desalination units during the war in Ukraine and other. And what is your role and what is your view on what was just said? Well, I think there's a lot. I think that we're mistaken in our debate if we think that defense are soldiers, lots of weapons, because I'm sorry, but if there is no fuel to put in the tanks and if you have no water to supply or strategic minerals to produce a certain number of your products, sirs, everything will stop in just a few days. So Prime Minister mentioned, let's try to learn from what's happening in Ukraine and not lead the war of 40 years back. And what if we learn from what is happening in the Middle East as well? Why, as on the next day of the beginning of the war, the first targets after the military equipment was what? It was the desalination plants. Veolia desalination, we're world leaders, 25% of the market, European leaders. So let us be proud that sometimes the industrialists have already solved this question at the scale of at the level of our subjects. But today we have problems with the desalination units in the Middle East, and that's not yesterday. It's been there for 30 years, so let's not be late in France and Europe. We were talking about vital operations with strategic and geostrategic operations. We must secure water supplies, raw materials, and local energy supplies. That is what is key, and that must be in the defense plan too. So we worked on the defense of the armies to guarantee the security of resources. What do you do? How do you go about this? In France, we do this. It's an operation of national interest, meaning that we have we're constantly in touch with defense to protect these plants. In the Middle East too. There is also questions that keep coming back because, you know, if a factory is bombed, we must be able to switch to a neighbouring factory. I would like to recall that water, we always think about tap water to supply the population, but without water you have no refineries, you have no petrol, you have no industry, you have no farming. And, you know, there's also a problem of food. And so we can see that this irrigates everything. So we will move on to the strategic minerals, which are also important in the defense industries themselves. In Metz, in the east of France, once again, there is an innovation. We're able to recycle strategic minerals from used batteries. If we do this at the European scale, it is 25% of the strategic mineral and rare earth that we must import. Today, it's 99% that is imported from China. Mr. Bouchard talked about Xi Jinping. Do we need to depend on him to close the tap, or do we try once again to move ahead to attain strategic autonomy? So, to put things simply, so this is what will help to guarantee sovereignty in terms of energy. So because I can't solve the problem of debt today, I would add spending for critical infrastructure. What do you think about what Stéphane Bouchard said on the fact of requisitioning companies, mobilizing citizens? Yes, Veolia is very present, and Mr. Lecornu, the Minister of Defense, and the Médaille d'Or of National Defense. I say we, these are the Veolia employees that are very involved in the active defense for many years now, and this is quite normal. So it's interesting to see how big French companies are involved in this national defense. I will turn towards Eric Béranger. This morning, Trump said about OTAN, and you know that next week, the NATO, last week, the NATO meeting happened in Turkey. They said it's no point in continuing to fund the Atlantic Alliance, where he produced a chart where we saw that America was the biggest funder of the alliance's defense. And it's a new warning signal for the Europeans. How do you perceive this? And when Trump says it's ridiculous to continue in this way, we have to do things differently, I would like to recall that France is at 2% of its GDP, and it's committed to move on to 3.5% and even 5% after the 2025 summit. Are we able to go that far, and how? Yes, I think that this was explained by previous speakers. I think the question was that we have no choice. what Trump has just said once again is not a surprise. But, you know, in fact, what is this all about? And the NATO, in terms of contribution, represents 50% by the states, 25% the European Union, and 25% the members of the alliance that are neither the states nor the EU. That is the actual, those are the facts. If the United States, and this is the direction they're adopting, and they've even announced a strategic review of their contribution to NATO. If they're moving away from NATO, I think that the signal for us as French people beyond that is clear. We must take this on board. We have no choice. And we must look after ourselves as French people, but we must also look after ourselves at the European level. And this notion of cooperation that we were both talking about with Stéphane are absolutely key. And there are a number of ways of cooperating, as Stéphane recalled. And we must think about this defense, globally speaking, because the infrastructures also. There is one word that I think that we must all bear in mind, which is that of resilience, meaning that it's not a question only of being able to do things at a given time, but in addition to that, we must be resilient and be able to resist potentially dramatic events. Earlier on, you were asking me what our priorities were in media, and that is to help our countries to support, to bear two shocks. The initial shock, if ever we were attacked or tested, and the question of the stocks. For each of the states, the challenge is to rebuild our stocks. And this is something that we're being asked to do every day. And beyond this initial shock, there will be the long-lasting shock. And so there's a lesson of the conflict in Iran, where we see everything that the United States have consumed in just 4 days. And this is the industrial depth. And I think that recently it was explained that the military capacity of a country also depends on the strategic depth of its industry. So you're touching upon an essential point there, the question of stocks. We were talking about the lack of munitions earlier on. France globally has is catching up with the drones because we're lagging behind. On this specific point, as an industrialist, do we have this capacity? The signal was heard. Are we rebuilding our stocks? Can you tell us that today? Well, yes, I have the impression that this is the case, absolutely. And once again, no, beyond announcements, so now we're making more munitions, more, etc. Yes, I gave you. Yes, generally speaking, yes, it is speeding up very fast, including in the field of drones. I think that we must be lucid and look at all of the areas in which we must progress. But we have everything we need. Today, we still have everything we need. And therefore, it is really today that we must react. So I will turn to Gabriel Attal, the key question for everybody. For the national defense, European defense, we must fund this effort. So this morning you announced, for example, some major reductions in social expenditure, the reduction of the number of civil servants. What do you say to the French to guarantee that these defense efforts are possible? Well, first of all, in this interview for the Parisian newspaper this morning, I fixed a framework and an objective, that of coming back to an economic balance in the 2 5-year periods and to be below 3% before the next 5-year period. That doesn't seem very possible. I believe it is possible. In 2024, for the first time for the past 15 years, the state spent less than the previous year. I didn't say this, it's the INSEE that said this, because there are efforts made. I was Prime Minister at the time. And so we cut 10 million euros over a year. They cut the medical franchise, which hadn't moved for 20 years, to freeze a certain number of credits. And the result is that the state expenditure in 2024 was below that of 2023. It happened for 15 years because we made a choice. And if the deficit increased that year, it's because social expenditure went through the roof. I'd like to come back to what Nicolas Dufour was saying. Social expenditure, the social part represents 2/3 of our expenditure. And therefore, therefore we must assume that it's 2/3 of the savings. I'm making proposals. I'm not going to detail the interview today. I made some very clear proposals in this interview on the question of retirements, on the question of unemployment payments and health insurance. We can need a certain number of reforms. Then there is state reforms. I propose in particular the reduction of the number of civil servants, because we have this revolution of artificial intelligence that does allow us to do better with less, and all companies can see this. And a big bang in the territorial organization of France and local authorities, because there again there are savings to be made. But once we've said this, I would say, okay, well, French people it's all very good, but we've hearing what the politicians have been saying over the years, but we've seen the debt go through the roof. Therefore, we have to establish a method. That's why I propose that French, through referendum, can decide, as the Germans did in 2009, of a budgetary constitutional golden rule, which in a few years will prevent us from having social security budgets that are in deficit. I propose a managerial method. There are a lot of company directors here in the room. In your company, when a director of financial affairs explodes their objectives and don't meet their objectives in terms of expenditure, there is an impact. Well, it must be the same thing for those that manage the states, be it ministers or central administrators, when you don't meet your objectives in terms of public expenditure. I would just end, because we're talking about public funding questions, and of course it's important, and I've just set a framework, but there's also the question of private funding, which is key for our defense industries. So there are two ways of funding this, and of course there is lending and equity. I think that, loans, it's less difficult for companies than in the past, because taxonomy has changed, and unfortunately there is a market in this context. So for banks, it's more secure, and for equity, there are still some difficulties for certain reasons, and we have less capital than the Americans. So that's why I'm arguing for capital savings for retirement. And we have Laurent Lescure, who's the Minister of Economy and Finances. We have rules on foreign investments in France, which means that for investments to come into the capital of a defense industry, whereas we don't really know whether there will be an exit at the end because there are very strict rules, it's very complicated. Therefore, we must unroll funds that allow us to support and invest in our companies, defense companies, what countries do with developed funds. I think we need to scale things up, maybe with a coalition of industrialists of the sector, as they were able to do for aeronautics in the support plan with the Aerospace Fund. I think that there are levers that we haven't yet mobilized on these subjects. Stéphane Boujana, you can see Gabriel Attal's program. But today, you, as a representative of the stock exchange, how can we contribute to funding the efforts, not only in France, but at the European level? Well, there are two subjects. There are a certain number of defense groups of a large size that access markets because the public command is there, and the growth perspectives are significant. And so in recent weeks, there's been a wonderful Czech group called CSG that came into the stock exchange, and then a Norwegian group, Conspend Maritime, and the operation has been suspended because there was an unfortunate news flow on a comparable German product. But, regarding cooperation, I won't come back to this, it's absolutely key. I believe that, when we talked about the SCAF, the only way of solving the tension between industrialists is to consolidate them, is to get them to working together. And the problems must be managed. So there must be deliberations in the board. So, but when we can, in this way, we can bring together industrialists. But as Nicholas mentioned, and he was right, the SMEs, the supply chain the problem of a big defense project is that the speed of a defense project is limited by the slowest supplier in the supply chain. And it's true that to speed up the transformation, the scaling up of these smaller companies, we must envisage two things: their consolidation and their quotation, so they can raise equity. And this is what we're trying to do. But I must really underline this. The countries that have difficult neighbors do this. Last like Norwegians have 340 kilometers of borders with Russians that are 200 kilometers from amongst, which is the greatest nuclear weapon concentrations in the world. That's how they do. That's like, the countries with Russian borders do all of this. So we must be aware of the threat and aware that we must dissuade the bad guys of attempting anything against us, and therefore all society must come together within a mechanism of total defense, and the stock exchange can contribute to this. Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of this roundtable. I would thank everybody, but just Nicolas Dufour, in one word, a conclusion. Is France ready for these challenges, for these efforts and sacrifices, or not? No, not yet. No, not yet at all. And no, honestly. What is the presidential for? It's for us to make efforts. So we must speak about this. We must, get everybody in French society to debate about this. But just to react to what Stéphane said and answer the question, are we ready at the military level to speed history up radically? Personally, I'm not sure either. Why? Because we're once again looking at timelines that are of a previous era with 6-year, 7-year, 8-year programs, whereas Ukraine teaches us that we need 3-month programs. So this cultural transformation has begun. And so something is happening in the French fabric, and to say that we've managed to deal with this problem would be wrong. So that's a very frank, direct diagnostic. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to the speakers.